This is Tehran right now. In the last 100 hours, Iran's security architecture fractures under blackout, and it may be the beginning of regime decapitation. Because if the Revolutionary Guard command chain fails, then the entire coercion system collapses. Streets don't just fill with slogans, they are filled with hunters. Homes get marked, convoys get tracked, police stations get stormed, and the people stop running. They start targeting. But what happened next is the part nobody is talking about, the part that changes everything. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Nate, and this is where we break down geopolitics and modern regime warfare into insights you can actually use and understand. If you want deep dive updates on what's really happening behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to show you isn't being covered anywhere else with this level of detail, how a state doesn't just lose control of streets, it loses control of its own nervous system. Today I'm analyzing how Iran's unrest allegedly evolved into a systematic decapitation campaign against regime enforcers, and why it matters because it triggers three consequences at once: military paralysis inside the IRGC, economic hemorrhaging across the shadow economy, and political contagion that can spread beyond Iran's borders. By the end of this video, you'll understand three critical things: how the targeting mechanism allegedly works, why it shatters the regime's deterrence strategy from the inside out, and what happens next when fear changes sides permanently. And trust me, once you see the full picture, you'll realize this is one of the most dangerous forms of 21st century internal warfare. Here's the clean timeline of exactly what went down. On January 3rd, a local commander, Colonel Mardi Rahimi, is accused of ordering live fire in Malik Shahi, killing 10 protesters, turning a street crackdown into a personal blood debt that doesn't expire when the crowds disperse. During the following days, the regime allegedly imposes a 100-hour electricity and internet blackout, attempting to blind coordination and choke momentum. But the blackout also traps commanders inside predictable routines, home, office, convoy, like animals pacing a cage. Then in cities like Mashhad and Babel, the narrative shifts from protests to raids. Homes reportedly get marked, routes tracked, and police infrastructure hit, including a prison release raid and a station burned, signaling that deterrence has flipped. Now, the public story being pushed by mainstream outlets is protests, crackdown, and control restored. But the real story, the one you need to understand, is system disruption, a move away from crowd confrontation and toward targeting the nodes that make repression possible. And once you see the mechanism behind this, you'll realize this wasn't random, this wasn't reactive, this was planned, coordinated, and executed with surgical precision. To understand why this matters so much, you have to look at Iran's internal security system not as just police and troops, but as a critical machine in the regime's survival strategy. It contains the IRGC command network that issues orders, the Basij-style street enforcement layer that executes them, the detention infrastructure that turns fear into silence, and the information control apparatus that smothers evidence before it becomes truth. It feeds three strategic purposes. It prevents coalition building among civilians, it protects the elite from consequences, and it guarantees the money pipelines, smuggling, patronage, and coercive economics keep flowing. So when attackers hit not just the streets but the communications and enforcement nodes, they're not just trying to protest, they're trying to turn the state's armor into a prison. This is about cutting the puppet strings, not fighting the puppet. Here's the brilliant part, the twist that makes this operation so devastating. The alleged tactic isn't mass uprising first, it's identification first. If the claim is accurate, the sequence goes: find names, find homes, mark doors, track routes, strike fast. That turns the regime's biggest advantage, centralized control, into its biggest weakness, predictable hierarchy. Inside Defender Command, when commanders realize people can find them at home, it creates an absolutely brutal choice with no good options: either retreat and hide, abandoning the chain of command and signaling weakness, or stay visible and risk becoming the next example. And here's what always happens in these situations: panic wins. Desperation wins. It's like a fortress discovering the walls are solid, but the keys are already in the enemy's hands. You've already committed to the chase, but the game was over before you even started. Now, this is where the operation gets truly interesting, where you see the layers of strategic thinking. While the defender tries to restore order with blackouts and threats, the attacker allegedly plays a quieter game: node removal. What changed everything, what made this permanent, was three simultaneous strategic moves executed in perfect coordination. First, the targeting expands beyond street confrontations into elite vulnerability, meaning commanders don't just fear crowds, they fear bedrooms, driveways, secure routes, and routines that used to feel untouchable. That forces protective resources to collapse inward. Second, police infrastructure gets hit, like the Babel Station raid, which doesn't just free detainees, it wipes out local fear production capacity. When a detention center burns, the regime loses the tool that turns dissent into silence. Third, symbolic territory emerges, barricaded liberated zones and pre-revolutionary flags, turning protest into an alternative legitimacy project, a psychological declaration that the regime's story no longer owns the future. And here's the open loop, the part that makes this damage permanent. Once commanders believe they can't protect themselves, they stop taking initiative. Once local units stop trusting orders, they hesitate. Once hesitation spreads, it becomes doctrine. And when fear migrates upward from civilians to elites, the entire system transforms from a predator into prey. Most people, when they think about war, they think about destroying tanks, planes, bases, and soldiers. But modern warfare, real 21st century strategic warfare, is about destroying the brain of your enemy's operation, not just the body. Logistics matters because it turns power into presence. If fuel convoys, safe houses, and unit rotations fail, forces can't surge, can't reinforce, can't respond, and every delay becomes a visible crack civilians can exploit. Energy infrastructure matters because it's coercion's heartbeat. Lights, data centers, command rooms. Without stable power, surveillance collapses, communications degrade, and the state can't synchronize violence at scale. Communications networks matter because narrative is a battlefield. Once information control fails, civilian video becomes evidence. Evidence becomes outrage, and outrage becomes recruitment, faster than any propaganda office can contain. Financial systems matter because repression costs money every day. Salaries, bribes, patronage, smuggling channels. When those choke, loyalty doesn't weaken, it evaporates. Morale and psychological cohesion matters because fear is contagious. If soldiers watch commanders fall, they start asking the fatal question, if the generals can't be protected, how can I? That question spreads like smoke through barracks. So the goal of this operation wasn't revenge. The goal was strategic brain damage, making the regime's security machine misfire, hesitate, and fracture under its own weight. And that's exactly what's happening right now. A psychological shift where the state loses perceived inevitability and the opposition gains perceived momentum. Now let's look at the ripple effects, because this doesn't just impact the immediate targets. It creates cascading consequences across every level of society. Economically, when the security system destabilizes, markets don't just wobble, they seize. Business closes early, supply chains reroute, smuggling networks scramble. If key IRGC-linked figures tied to illicit revenue streams get removed, the regime loses cash velocity, meaning fewer paid loyalists, fewer reliable enforcers, and more bribery costs per unit of obedience. Militarily, the regime cannot surge without exposing commanders. It cannot deploy aggressively without creating vulnerable routes. It cannot centralize response without revealing command nodes. It cannot rely on local police if stations become targets. It cannot restore deterrence if each crackdown generates a named offender the public can hunt. Politically, the effect is an earthquake. Deterrence flips, legitimacy fractures, and alternative symbolism, flags, barricades, liberated zones, functions like a prototype state. Even if the regime survives, the myth of total control dies publicly, and that changes how allies, rivals, and internal elites calculate risk. Do you understand the magnitude of that shift? This stops being a protest cycle. It becomes a restructuring of fear itself. And here's the part people underestimate, the psychological dimension. Fear is a weapon more powerful than missiles. At the command level, leaders start sleeping in different rooms, changing routes compulsively, distrusting bodyguards, and narrowing the circle of safe people until decision-making becomes paranoid and slow. At the civilian level, once people see a police station burned and prisoners released, the mental barrier breaks. They stop imagining the state as permanent. They start imagining the state as temporary. The artificial illusion of invulnerability the regime spent decades constructing begins collapsing in real time. Let's talk numbers, because when you do the math on this operation, the strategic logic becomes crystal clear. The attacker's cost to execute this kind of campaign, if the claims are accurate, comes down to 4 cheap tools: phones, local spotters, basic transport, and small arms or improvised explosives. Total operational cost, tens of thousands of dollars per city-scale wave, tiny compared to state budgets. Now compare that to the defender's costs: emergency redeployments, protection details, surveillance overload, disrupted revenue streams, international reputational shock, and the one loss no dictatorship can afford: its aura of inevitability. The geopolitical cost? incalculable, because once the regime looks vulnerable at home, its deterrence abroad starts to rot, too. That cost ratio becomes effectively infinite to one, spending almost nothing to inflict catastrophic strategic damage. And that's how you checkmate a coercive state, not by beating it head on, but by making obedience too expensive to maintain. This becomes a situation where the defender can't win by brute force. They can only win by conceding legitimacy, and the leadership's ego will never allow that. So the regime tightens, and the tightening becomes the strangulation. So what happens next? Where does this situation go from here? There are two likely paths forward, and both of them end badly for the defender. Scenario 1, the blackout spiral. If the regime doubles down on outages, mass arrests, and terror messaging, then it temporarily reduces coordination, but it also increases rage, expands the target set, and forces security forces into permanent defensive posture. Historically, once a regime relies on darkness, it admits it cannot compete in daylight. That admission becomes propaganda for the opposition. And every new crackdown produces new names, new grudges, new hunters. Scenario 2, the fragmentation shock. If elite factions start blaming each other, IRGC versus army, intelligence versus police, hardliners versus pragmatists, then command coherence fractures, units hesitate, some defect quietly, others stand down to avoid becoming targets. Diplomatic options narrow and the regime faces impossible choices: escalate into civil war or negotiate from weakness. Either option signals vulnerability to regional allies and rivals. But either way, no matter which scenario plays out, one reality is now permanent and irreversible. Once fear changes sides, the old regime never feels safe again. And when a regime can't promise safety to its enforcers, it can't purchase loyalty, can't enforce silence, and can't maintain the illusion that it will always win. So here's my question to you, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. If a regime's coercion system starts collapsing from targeted node pressure, what's the most effective counter-strategy? More repression, reforms, or elite reshuffling? And here's the second question, the human element. If you were a civilian in a city where blackouts hit, shots get fired, and police stations become battlegrounds, what choice would you make to protect your family, leave, hide, or resist? Drop your thoughts below. I want to know what you think happens next. If you found this breakdown valuable, if you learned something about how modern geopolitical power actually works behind the headlines, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and share this video with anyone who wants to understand what's really happening in Iran right now. Because this story isn't over. This is just the beginning of a much larger shift in the balance of power. And I'll be here breaking it down every step of the way. I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.